How do you give birth to a nation? In the last quarter of the 18th century, this was a question that was taxing the minds of politicians in the embryonic USA. Law, order, foreign policy, defense, everything was on the table and needed to be shaped urgently if this new nation was to thrive. Key amongst the priorities was a new set of laws, a constitution that could bring a people who had just been involved in the equivalent of a civil war together and set the nation on a stable footing. But what did that look like in practice? Tonight, Tom Cutterham makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut as we talk about the foundation of the fledgling United States. We discuss whether the nation was on life support before it even got off the ground, whether it had any meaningful friends, and how they sought to shape a nation from the horrors of the War of Independence. This is the birth of the USA, Confederation America. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. And it's an exciting day because what you're listening to is not only a new episode, but a new series. That's right, because for the big anniversary year of 2025, that is the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the American War of Independence, we are going big with more American content. And as part of that is this series, which doesn't have a name yet, but I suppose it's the Early America series or something like that. What we're going to be doing is walking you through US political history from the moment of independence in 1783 all the way up to 1825, the end of Monroe's presidency, and really the terminus of this podcast scope. And in these episodes, we're going broad, we're going eclectic because, well, it is us, and we're also talking about American history generally, be it domestic, diplomatic, military, to really give you an overview of the early United States at this time when everything was really hanging in the balance. Right, I said we're going president by president, but that's a lie, which we're immediately gonna make because, as you may well know, American independence in 1783 did not mean a president came to power immediately, because we instead have the Confederation period. And as you will know by the end of this episode, this lesser known presidentless period in American history is actually a key chapter in the history of the United States. So we have to include it rather than just skipping from Yorktown to Washington. On the show today, the first of our expert Americanists in this series is Dr. Tom Cutterham of the University of Birmingham. And God, he's perfect for this show because he has wide-ranging interests in the American Revolution and the early United States. His book, Gentlemen Revolutionaries, Power and Justice in the New American Republic, is available via Princeton University Press and more or less corresponds exactly to the years we're talking about in this episode. So if you're interested in the topic, check it out. Tom, welcome to the show. Your debut. How are you?
Hi, looking forward to talking about the Confederation period.
Great to have you. Joining me also is the familiar, ever-reliable organizer of victory himself, Dr. Zach White.
The organizer of victory, that's a new one. Are you kind of throwing titles at me, much like the bow acquires them, and sort of hoping that I sort of have this long list? You know, I'll be like Murat by the end of this podcast series, I'm sure.
Well, I've been really horrible to you lately, so I feel like I should start reconciling a little bit by giving you some titles.
Is this as a result of me threatening to dock your pay when you were particularly rude to me last time out?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay. See, I can see you attempting to massage my ego. It might work. It might work. In terms of, I love that we haven't even interviewed our first guest yet, and yet you've decided that we are having this kind of massive series to celebrate the 250th, and it's just happening.
Yes,
You know,
I've
I keep
decided that.
talking about how you're kind of the babyface podcaster, and you're kind of looking to usurp me from my throne as sort of the person in charge here, and I'm seeing you exercise that power. I've got my eye on you, Mr. Redden. But yes, this kind of, I think we'll call it the Birth of America series,
That's a
probably,
bad name.
maybe, because that's exactly what we're talking about. But yeah, it's a really, obviously it's important to do it for the 250th. So quite obviously we're recording this before the new year, but Happy New Year, folks. And it's a really nice opportunity to, as you say, kind of really dig into the various facets of this period. And I'm sure we'll get some heat because we're a couple of Brits talking about the USA, and there's a certain kind of school of thought that seems to coalesce in certain corners of the US that sort of implies that only Americans are allowed to talk about American history, which I struggle with. Objectivity matters. Mind you, are we entirely objective as Brits? That would be a powerful counter argument right there. But enough waffle from me. Let's dive on in. Tom, it's fantastic to have you. Thank you for agreeing to do this. Josh, you do the honors.
So, well, let's just literally begin where the American Revolution leaves off. So, thinking geopolitically in 1783, the US having just declared independence, if you had to kind of evaluate it or kind of do a SWOT analysis, what do you think its strengths and weaknesses are geopolitically?
Great. Okay. Yeah. So in 1783, the point is the war is now over, right? We've not only declared independence, but we've actually kind of forced the British Empire to acknowledge that independence and end their attempts to kind of cut the whole thing off at the root. The biggest strength that the United States has now at this point, obviously having won the war, is its distance, its kind of isolation from European powers, and that's something that's going to come up as a political issue later on in the history of the United States. Kind of this ability to kind of exist separately from European continental warfare and geopolitical kind of power struggles. So that's a strength, and there's a whole continent looking west. There appears, from the perspective of newly independent American leaders, a whole continent potentially on their doorstep for them to conquer and exploit, essentially. On the other hand, there are some very serious weaknesses that the United States has to kind of contend with. And one of those is, of course, there isn't just an empty continent on their borders, on their backstep. There is a continent full of indigenous people, many of whom have just fought, quite vigorously to defend their own power on the borders of the colonial settlement. And then there's the fact that those indigenous nations, various confederations of different indigenous peoples, in the Northwest and the Southwest, they have still very close alliances with the British Empire in the Northwest and the Spanish Empire in the Southwest. And from the American perspective, both of those European empires are still really significant threats to the future expansion of the United States, the kind of border colonization that many of their citizens are wanting to do, that we're going to talk about later, but also genuine potential threats of future kind of invasion, future warfare again with these European powers. So that is a serious problem. And there's one more thing that I'll mention, which is obviously the American economic situation is fairly fragile. They massively depend, and this doesn't change after the war, depend on economic relationships with Britain, the British Empire. Most of what they're selling is going to British buyers, and most of what they're buying is coming from British sellers. Most of the credit that Americans are using, their kind of lines of credit, their loans are coming from London American merchants, and that can cause problems too. The working out of a trade relationship, of a new commercial relationship with Britain, is the top priority of American diplomats after 1783, because that really wasn't sorted out with the Treaty of Paris.
And just thinking internally for a sec, how stable is the USA at this point in time, given that you've had part of the challenge of the American War of Independence was that there wasn't a unity around, okay, the entire nation is up in arms against colonial rule. You've got some people who are in favor, some are against, and you've got to bring those together in order to create that internal sense of unity.
That's true, Zach, but I think actually the war has a really powerful and useful effect from this perspective. It's the war itself that allows Americans to kind of construct and then enforce a sense of patriotic nationalism. It used to be that historians would imagine that the American Revolution kind of emerged from a growing sense of American nationalism. Now we're much more likely to put it the other way around, that the war came first, and out of that was created a kind of idea of the United States, the national existence of the colonies. On the other hand, of course, we're still talking about 13 separate independent states. And I know we're going to get on in a second to talking about how they related to each other politically, but fundamentally, Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia, not from the United States at this point. And so there's no real immediate threat of states going to war with one another, but there are plenty of fairly significant disputes about exactly where the borders lie, especially Western borders, and then disputes about who exactly is taxing who, who's controlling the trade into which ports and so on. So there are disputes that are going to need to be resolved.
That's interesting, and I really envisage kind of, if this is to become a series, which I think it is, over the course of kind of these years of American history, there really being a conflict between like America as a whole and America as the states, and trying to, like, a key theme I imagine is going to be America ironing out that part of identity. Indeed, perhaps to this day as well. Um, I want to return to something you mentioned earlier about America's kind of diplomacy and the fact it's allied with Britain, and you didn't mention France, but that too. Um, so having just kind of got out of a war with Britain, there's an anecdote I like, and it's that at the Treaty of Paris, Benjamin Franklin and the British delegate David Hartley, they were kind of spotted laughing and joking with one another by the French delegate Vergennes, and he was incandescent to see France's supposed ally, who they'd just been pouring so much money into. They'd already reconciled with the British, and now, ironically, America seemed to be just as good friends with the British, even better. So can you, I guess, explain the paradox of America's kind of instant reconciliation with Britain, and more generally, perhaps, who the US's friends and enemies were, and how willing are countries to engage with the US?
Right, great. Yeah, I mean, the question of friends and enemies is always more or less a complicated one, but I think it's particularly complicated in this example, in this case, because, like you say, as soon as the war with Britain is over, Britain immediately becomes the most important player in the United States kind of diplomatic and, most importantly, commercial, its economic kind of world, and it just always has been. So it's not that, it's not that every American wants to immediately forget the war and everything that's happened. Many people kind of retain for the rest of their lives a kind of virulent anti-Anglicism, a kind of real memory of hatred, and that's true. But at the same time, they just can't kind of wish away the fact that Britain is going to remain the most important economic partner, and that's especially true in the kind of Caribbean trade, for example. So the places that the trading patterns that had allowed the colonies to grow relatively prosperous before the revolution, the goal is to bring those back as quickly as possible. So we've got that. On the other hand, now we're outside the empire. The United States is outside the British Empire. That trading relationship is very fraught. It remains to be diplomatically negotiated, but new opportunities are there. So you've got France and Spain as your allies. They entered the war basically in order to give Britain a bit of a kicking, if possible. They're not massively pleased with the outcome of the war. Obviously, it's good that the United States is independent, but in most other respects, the British kind of won the rest of the War of American Independence. They maintained control of their Caribbean possessions, which is the most important thing. They maintained control of places like Gibraltar, which Spain had really wanted to get in this war. So the French and Spanish, kind of, your anecdote kind of speaks to this, right? That the French and Spanish are a little bit disappointed with the outcome of this war, having spent so much of their money. They remain friends and allies of the United States. They create new commercial relationships, but they're still very much marginal players when it comes to the economy of the United States at the end of the day. And then you've got, of course, a whole range of relationships with indigenous peoples on the continent and other European countries as well. The United States are trying to trade with everyone, including, in fact, all the way around the Pacific into Canton. The Empress of China, the first American ship trading kind of independently to China, leaves port in 1784. That's a real moment of kind of optimism about the potential for the United States independently to kind of be a world trading power in its own right. And to be honest, most of that optimism turns out to be misplaced. The United States continues to be massively dependent on Britain for the next couple of decades, at least.
You were talking earlier about this sort of sense of there potentially being enemies everywhere, that sort of almost sort of shocks circling this new nation that sort of feels, because it is so new and there is so much to do, and this is large, I think, probably totally unprecedented. A nation with strong imperial connections suddenly deciding to go it alone. There is this sort of sense, if you sort of sit back and ponder it, that perhaps this set of nations is this set of states is sort of easy pickings. There's also a kind of problem here for imperial powers in that if one nation can do it, if one colony can break away, or albeit 13, and form this union, others could do the same thing. So is there a sort of a sense of folks being, other nations being quite keen to perhaps nip this in the bud or dominate this new inverted commas minor nation, and therefore prevent the potential unrest from sort of spreading across their own empires?
I think that the US, the mainland colonies situation, is fairly unique in amongst the European empires of this period, because you have such a large population of basically migrants from the metropole. So white people, let me be clear. You've got a large population of educated, increasingly prosperous white people living on a continent with access to space to expand. It's pretty different from most of the colonial setup that you have throughout the kind of global empires that European nations have constructed over the last 3 centuries, which are mostly, either they're islands where they're doing slave plantation economies, or they're kind of coastal fortresses and coastal trading posts and so on. The exception to that is obviously Spanish South America. And Spanish South America, it's not my area of expertise. The Spanish Empire is allied to the United States out of its ambition to damage British control. But of course, as time goes by, by the time you get to the end of your putative podcast series here, the Spanish Empire in South America is clearly going to be in trouble as well. And that's part of the wider age of revolutions. I don't see, as far as I know, the Spanish weren't thinking, oh my gosh, this could happen to us on the basis of the American Revolution.
So turning back again, I guess, to domestic politics, where obviously the United States has to hit the ground running internationally, but on the inside, it gains independence, and all of a sudden there's the question of constituting the state. I say it's a bit of a lie, because they already have a constitution. I guess I'm deliberately trying to link the two etymologies there, but they've written a putative constitution in 1781, not the constitution that people will be more familiar with today, though. The Articles of Confederation, written in 1781, as I say, and it becomes kind of the first constitution of the independent United States. Who has written this document? What are their influences, and what are the key differences, I guess, between that and the constitution we're familiar with at the moment?
Yeah, so the Articles of Confederation, which they're ratified, so they come officially into force in 1781, but they were actually written kind of way before that, back in 1776, like quite soon, within months of the Declaration of Independence. The Congress was obviously thinking, well, okay, now we're an independent nation, we're going to have a government, we're going to have a framework of government. So they set up a committee to write that framework of government, the Articles of Confederation. It's a committee of the old guard revolutionary congressmen, right? So people who have been in Congress for a couple of years have already been engaged with the kind of problem of trying to coordinate these 13 different states, coordinate their relationship with Britain, coordinate how they're going to potentially fight this war, because the war has obviously begun before 1776, before the Declaration of Independence. So you have leading members of this committee like John Dickinson, a kind of moderate figure, right? Kind of not one of your gung-ho radical independencists, but he goes along with independence once it's been declared. John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, and then the more gung-ho radical guy, Sam Adams, from Boston, from Massachusetts. Those are the two leading members of this committee that draws up these Articles of Confederation. And you can tell from the fact that they weren't actually ratified until 1781 that they are pretty controversial. And the controversy basically arises from the fact that it's really hard to get these independent states that are very, suddenly kind of proud of their independence and have their own political setups and their own interests, basically, that are not always commensurate, to get them to cooperate with each other, to find a framework that's going to allow them to work together effectively is really difficult. One of the key areas of difficulty in negotiating the Articles of Confederation is claims to Western land. So you can see that this is coming in again and again, right? What's going to happen to the rest of the American continent? Who gets to own those? You have states like Connecticut with, you can see hilarious maps of this, right? With claims that basically run to the Pacific. Connecticut, the state of Connecticut could go from sea to shining sea as far as Roger Sherman was concerned, right? In the early 1780s. But then other states are kind of opposing that, and you get a lot of difficulty. Eventually, the bigger states like Virginia make concessions. Again and again, they make concessions to bring everyone else on board. So it's not until 1781 that these articles are actually ratified. But basically, all they do, they're already working de facto from 1776 onwards to bring people together in a Congress. Each state gets one vote, even though they might have more than one representative. They have to vote in a block. So you might be outvoted by your two other Massachusetts delegates, for example. Each state gets one vote, so that's good for the small states. And the fundamental thing about the Articles of Confederation, the reason that they are not going to last very long in the long run, is that they don't deal with the most important question of all, which is taxation. Where is the United States going to get its money from? The Articles of Confederation simply say each state will contribute that money proportionately to their wealth, and they'll just do it. And of course, that doesn't actually work out very well during the war itself. So you end up with situations where Congress is basically printing money, trying to pay its way, causing enormous inflation, making a lot of difficulty. And there's still, by the end of the war, you've got a really complex set of problems about the states kind of having to pay back some of those debts. And a Congress that doesn't have real political power because it doesn't have financial power.
What does the Articles of Confederation say in terms of setting up a government and a legislature? And I guess implicit within that question is, how does it address the balance between like the independence of the individual states and kind of the integrity of the United States as a whole?
So yes, so the main thing that the Articles of Confederation does is establish Congress itself as the government. And it's an interesting thing because it is effectively it's a unicameral legislature, but the legislature acts like an executive committee. That's what Congress basically is through the war. It's an executive committee whose job is to control the war effort. It's not there kind of making all sorts of, long-term laws and provisions for the future of the United States. It is just organizing the war effort and the diplomatic stuff that goes alongside that. So fundamentally, what you need to do is support George Washington and his army, find ways of making that all work, coordinating the one thing that all the colonies actually agree on, which is we've got to get the Brits out. We've got to win this war. That's what they agree on, which is why it's perfectly possible for the Congress to go forward from 1776 to 1781. There is no ratified constitutional document. There is no Articles of Confederation. It's not even been ratified, but it still happens. Like, they still get together and make agreements because they all agree we've got to win this war. That's also, of course, the reason why things start to fall apart in the mid-1780s, because once the war has actually been won, that no longer holds. And the states have even less reason to give Congress any money, because why should they? What the hell's the point of Congress at this point? And that's the problem that you're facing when you get into 1784, that nationalists, people who want there to be a United States government, they are now in a really delicate position because actually there almost is no United States government.
Sorry, Zach, I have another one. But that kind of begs the question then, who's in charge of America? Because they seem to think they can go without a single figure from what you're saying. So who are the key people kind of at the head of this, and what is their hope for who's making the decisions?
See, in a way, Josh, I think you're taking it from a really monarchist kind of perspective when you're asking who's in charge. Someone like Thomas Paine would say, who helped to write the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1776, right? He would say having a single president or having a single leader for a state, that's not a good way to go. That leads us towards tyranny. Much better to have an executive committee that is a multitude of people that can be responsible to the voters, that can't have one person building up power for themselves. So that's a serious position that Americans held in the 1770s and the early 1780s, and that many continue to hold even through the Constitutional Convention period. So there is no one person in charge. In a way, there can't be, because there are these different states with different interests. The closest person to being one person in charge by the end of the Revolutionary War is George Washington. He's in charge of the army. It takes him a few years to really reach that position. There are some genuine opponents to Washington's kind of hegemony early on, but he's got the most political power by the end of the war, which is why it's considered such a big deal that he willingly and happily kind of resigned that position, gave back that power, and returned to his own estate for the mid 1780s. But you have presidents of Congress, right? So these are the first presidents of the United States, but they really are just kind of basically temporary chairmen of a committee of states. And that is what Congress is during this period.
I am loving the critique of Josh there, being far too monarchical.
It's because we're British. We literally kind of presaged this at the start, didn't we?
Well, you say it's because we're British. I wonder if actually it's just a reflection of where democracy went, that you have a figurehead in charge of government, and that actually there is an opportunity with this fledgling nation to just do things entirely differently. They don't have to conform to, because democracy isn't entrenched and doesn't have that kind of established system that exists today, because most of the other nations of Europe are autocracies, and these guys are thinking along European lines. They can turn around and go, well, what about something different? Why do we need one person in charge? Is that fair to say, Tom?
Yeah, exactly. So they want to be a republic. Democracy, that's not the word that most of the leaders of the revolution are going to use. There's a bit of an ick factor about democracy at this point still, for people of wealth and power. But they want to be a republic. So they're looking back to the republics of the ancient world, ancient Athens, ancient Rome, where there wasn't one guy in charge in ancient Rome. There were two, censors or whatever. There's an arrangement of power amongst a group of people that's basically an oligarchy. Same kind of thing in modern, contemporary Geneva, for example. There are a couple of republics around. They're generally small. They're generally not very geopolitically significant, but they do exist. And that's what these Americans are trying to think about. How can we reproduce that? How can we generate a republic on a massive scale? That's basically the big political problem for American thinkers in the 1780s and 90s.
Yeah, I probably should have kind of phrased that slightly better in terms of dropping the word democracy in there, especially considering we've done a two-parter on democracy with Malcolm Crook. I want to think about the slavery aspect within all of this and the politics of slavery within the US. You've made the point that this is a nation controlled by a white settler. I don't want to use the word class. Let's use the word population, because the word class during this period, that doesn't really kind of gel properly. But this is supposedly a war fought about liberty, about freedom of expression. And yet the economy of the United States is very much built on the antithesis of that, on slave labor. Now, you've got a number of these settlers who are slave owners. So some of them, particularly when it comes to the politicians at the top, they have a vested interest in the slave system. We traditionally sort of think about the South being much more invested in the institution of slavery than perhaps the North. How true is that of this kind of early phase? And are there really any arguments about sort of slavery and people being created equal, or is there sort of that trope of this period that you are equal if you are of a certain gender, i.e. male, and of a certain ethnicity, i.e., white.
There is so much that we could say about this. Honestly, we could have the whole hour talking about the different variations of these problems. So I'll try to kind of really put it as succinctly as I possibly can. The first thing about the economy of the United States as a whole, that's where you started, but then you move towards the more nuanced position that actually there's quite a lot of difference here, and that's what. So I'm going to emphasize there is quite a lot of difference across the states. It's really South Carolina and Eastern Virginia that are most dependent on the economy of slavery. Even in Western Virginia, even in the hills, you have people who are kind of minor slave owners, but they're mainly growing wheat. They could just as easily be yeoman farmers as big slave plantation owners, basically. There are only relatively small pockets of really kind of cash crop focused heavy slave plantation farming. And those are places that are hit very hard by the war because, in some sense, the greatest force for liberty in the American Revolution is the British Army and Navy, to which many enslaved people run away, and seek their freedom. Some of them actually do gain their freedom in places like Nova Scotia or later on in Sierra Leone. Some of them don't gain their freedom because they're basically sold back into slavery by the British. But from the perspective of enslaved African Americans during the war, there's really not much to choose between the British and the United States as a potential source of freedom. In the North, you have by the time we're talking about in 1783, slavery is more or less collapsed in Massachusetts and much of New England. So there were enslaved people in Massachusetts and its kind of neighboring New England states. Vermont, from its origins, it's like the 14th state from its origins. Part of Vermont's constitution is no slavery, right? The first place to actually enshrine in law the ban on slavery. Massachusetts, slavery collapses mainly due to the kind of efforts of enslaved people themselves. They go to court, they just leave their owners, they organize to kind of end that institution internally. And you can sort of see that can happen because it's not economically vital. It's not something on which the Massachusetts economy actually depends. Then you have places like Pennsylvania, where in 1780, a gradual Emancipation Act is passed. And the idea there is to kind of get a bit ahead of the problem and say, well, look, we're going to keep slavery for now. It's kind of enslaved people on large farms and plantations and so on. A few urban enslaved people. We're going to keep it for now, but you're only going to have to last another 25 years or so. I can't remember the exact timeline here, but the idea is slavery will be gradually abolished over a generation or two. That's the plan in Pennsylvania. New York, where there is quite a lot of slavery, especially amongst the most wealthy kind of long-term Dutch-descended kind of landlords of New York, they intend to have a gradual abolition process like Pennsylvania's, but they don't even manage to actually enact that law until 1799. So they're pretty slow off the mark in New York. So you've got a mixed picture across the states. I realize I'm going on too long already here, right? And I think behind that mixed picture of the actual process of emancipation, there is also a very mixed picture in terms of people's political attitudes, leaders, the press, the broader population, the white population of the United States, mixed attitudes towards freedom. I think it's fair to say that even most slave owners, it's always a bit weird to take Thomas Jefferson as kind of example of other people because he's such a unique weirdo. But let's take Thomas Jefferson as an example. He's a person who absolutely admits and is happy to say in writing that slavery is evil. It's a sin. It's clearly wrong. And not only is it wrong, but it also is a massive threat and a problem for the existence of a republic, for the existence of the United States. Slavery means there is always an internal enemy who's always going to want to rise up and claim their freedom if they can. And and of course, all sorts of other, even more racist things that Jefferson might think, like the threat of miscegenation. The purity of our whiteness will be sullied, and so on and so forth. So he thinks slavery is basically bad, but he also doesn't see any way of actually achieving its end. So you're in a bind, and many of the people who are in the positions like Jefferson's, positions of power, where they rely on their own enslaved property, they feel themselves to be in a bind where they can't really go either way. And they basically push the problem off to being, this is something that will be solved with time. Over time, slavery will probably disappear. It probably isn't the way of the future. And someone else other than us will solve this problem at some later point. So that's kind of the I would say the average position of Americans at this point. It's like, slavery is bad. It's not something we're going to spend all of our political capital on dealing with right now. There are some people, there's a bit of a spike in manumissions. So you could free your own slaves in Virginia, especially when you die, for example, when you're not going to be economically disadvantaged by that anymore. So there's a spike in manumissions in the 1780s period until the Virginia government starts to kind of clamp down on that a little bit more. And obviously there's more sense of abolitionism, more sense that slavery really is a very big problem the further north you go. The further away from communities that depend on slavery you go, the more abolitionism there is. And so the one last thing I'll say about that is it does become a problem in terms of political thought and political negotiation, because the people who live in slave states that depend on slavery still, they are very worried that if you give enough power to a central government, to a US government, then that government could be used to try and interfere with or abolish slavery. And that is a problem from the very beginning, that people from South Carolina, people from Virginia, people from Georgia worry that too much centralized power will put the power in the hands of people who don't like slavery and will try to interfere with it.
There's a certain sort of premonition almost of the arguments that Wilberforce will face, right, in the British Parliament of, well, yes, it's a nice idea, but is it really practical right now? It all seems a little bit difficult. What about financial aspects? These are important questions, and now's not the right moment, kind of thing. So it's interesting to see that kind of commonality across the two nations. I just want to stay with the ethnic diversity aspect for a moment to ask about whether there is any tension. Because on the one hand, we think about the USA as a nation that starts off being very cosmopolitan, fundamentally a nation that is founded on a vast amount of migration to the region. Now, admittedly, some of that kind of opening up of the borders to immigrants comes much later than this period. But when you have that perception, there is that sort of temptation to sort of think about the USA as sort of this great place of opportunity and sort of almost like a sort of a melting pot of cultures. But of course, at this moment in time, that perhaps isn't necessarily the case. And I'm curious about whether there is sort of tension along ethnic lines, along sort of different national lines. If you have a particularly high proportion of, let's say, Dutch individuals who are initially descended from Dutch immigrants, that's probably a better way of phrasing it. Does that lead to conflict with, I don't know, a bunch of people who originally are descended from Scots? Do we have these tensions both across racial lines fundamentally, but also across different nationalities of origin?
Definitely, absolutely. So, I mean, I love in the Federalist Papers where Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay are trying to defend the Constitution. We're going to get onto in a little bit. The second Federalist, John Jay, writes that it's wonderful that America is actually so united, and that we all speak English, and that everyone's kind of really one nation. Even the rivers kind of bring us together, and all these things. And that is all basically total bullshit, because in fact, the United States is full of, like you said, a hodgepodge of migrants, especially absolutely loads of German migrants in the middle states, right? So in Pennsylvania, sometimes they're referred to as Deutsch, right? So it's not Dutch, it's German. There's loads of German-speaking migrants in Pennsylvania and roundabout, and they are fighting for the revolutionary cause, which helps to make them Americans, of course. And they're also doing things like moving towards the border and pursuing, settler colonization. Generally speaking, they're not slave owners, so they're part of an anti-slavery coalition. And some people, so someone like Benjamin Rush, say, he's a founding father and a kind of early thinker about education and how do we create a viable republic in the long term. Benjamin Rush has a real bee in his bonnet about these kind of migrants. He basically thinks that the US is being filled with the trash of Europe, that poor people who can't get access to land in Europe are coming over in their droves in order to find land in the United States, which is true. And he says that, these people are a problem because we need to mold them into American citizens. And that's why, so this is a part of the impetus behind Rush's idea that we should institute a public education system, which obviously doesn't happen for decades and decades because it would be incredibly expensive and difficult. But part of his aim is we need to make sure that we need to kind of create a world where John Jay's point is actually true, that everyone does speak English, that everyone is kind of enculturated to be American. So there's definitely a lot of kind of ethnic antagonism through this period, and it's only going to become more of an issue in the age of the French revolutions as well. So by the time you get to the 1790s, the question of immigration and citizenship and kind of cultural and ethnic association becomes even more of a big deal. And you have loads of French people in places like Philadelphia and port cities who basically are very gung-ho pro-French Revolution for the most part. And again, people like George Washington, American conservative leaders, find those people to be a real problem.
I get the sense from what you've been saying up to this point, or what you've mentioned a few times, that the question of the West, or the kind of the swathes of Resnolius, like lying beyond the Appalachians, is a really key question in early American politics. I think your anecdote of like a coast to coast Vermont is very funny, but it tells you a lot about the way they were kind of imagining the US of the future. So before the Revolution, there had been a curtailment of settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and there'd been kind of some effort to kind of moderate violence against the Amerindians who lived in the West. How did the early United States, or the United States of the Confederation period and more generally, approach the question of westward expansion and the inhabitants who lived there, though they might have liked to forget they did?
Yeah, great. So as you say, the 1763 proclamation line, basically a rule saying you can't go, any further than this in order to find land and in order to create new colonial settlements, is a cause of the American Revolution. It is a big problem for many of the people who have come out to these colonies because they can't get hold of their own land in Europe, because Europe is overcrowded and unequal. They've come out to the United States, they've come out to the colonies, the British North American colonies, in order to get easier access to land. And suddenly, actually, the British imperial system is restricting that and saying you can't do it. That is a major problem and a kind of source of tension leading up to the American Revolution. Once the revolution is successful, people basically say, well, brilliant. Okay, now we can do what we wanted to do. Now we can flood across the Appalachians and begin to colonize these spaces. And they do start to do that. Of course, the problem is the indigenous nations on the other side of those mountains aren't nothing. And they actually win quite a lot of victories. They do hold up the flow of colonists along quite a lot of that border during the 1780s. The United States has no effective army in the West in the 1780s. Basically has no effective army at all after 1783 and the end of the war. So it loses a lot of battles and people are being killed. Obviously, settlers are still kind of making their way into these places, and they're using their own, they're kind of banding together. So you have independent state movements, places that would become Kentucky and Tennessee. You have the state of Franklin in what is now Tennessee, right? So basically, gangs of would-be settlers who come together to try and defend themselves against the indigenous people whose land that they're stealing, and also to try and make some claims on the larger Congress, on the larger United States, to say, we matter too, and we should have representation in the government. That's a set of things that's going to have to be negotiated later. And then you have in the Southwest, for example, you have not only the Choctaw and Chickasaw and Cherokee, quite well organized, relatively strong indigenous nations defending those borders, but you also have the Spanish who work with them and who fund them and arm them and so on, make it much more difficult for Americans to simply stroll across the continent and set up farms wherever they want. And in the Northwest, of course, you have the British still, despite the terms of the Treaty of Paris, the British are still in their forts. And those forts are really trading centers, which they use from the American perspective, which they use to control indigenous people of the Northwest, so the Haudenosaunee and so on. And the Americans are constantly worried right up until the mid-1790s when they make a treaty to sort this out. They're worried that the British are going to encourage indigenous incursions into their territory. So on the one hand, yes, Americans see the revolution as an opportunity and they really want to continue pushing to the West. On the other hand, there are lots of challenges and problems that's going to entail. And it's not until the early 1790s, after the federal constitution is ratified, that they really organize a proper armed force that paves the way for settlement in the Northwest. It's going to matter a lot.
Is it fair to say that the British are doing exactly what you just suggested there, in terms of using the indigenous population as a means to restrict, inhibit, and just so that element of instability amongst the US and sort of, I guess, curtail the American vision for what their nation might look like?
Yes, absolutely fair to say that. It's a continuation of the British policy during the war itself, right? To kind of to try to maintain the loyalty of the most significant indigenous nations in that northwestern area, north of the Ohio River. And like I said, you have the Spanish doing it in the Southwest in a very similar way. And there's still even some French presence in, Illinois. Not official French government claims, but still French people. So although on some maps it could appear that the United States simply looks westward and sees an empty map, in reality, there very much is not an empty map.
When we get to 1787, you have the Constitutional Convention, kind of clues very much in the name of what the purpose of it is. But how do we get to that point where there is this decision, actually, you know what, we need to take a look at this. We need this convention to hash these issues out. Talk us through those kind of turning points that lead to this idea that this Confederation style system, it's not working. We need something more.
So some parts of this we've already spoken a little bit about, and that is to do with basically funding a federal government and especially a federal armed force. After the end of the Revolutionary War, 1783, states just simply stopped funding Congress. And many congressmen who had just appointed delegates to the states basically stopped turning up to Congress. It's like a tutorial session in the last week of term when 2/3 of the students can't be bothered to come into the room at all. So you have Congress in a moribund state by 1785, 1786. And it's not able to organize and fund a proper US Army, which would be what you need if you want to really forge into the Ohio country and allow these settlers to actually conquer this territory, which is what does happen in the 1790s. So that's one problem. And of course, you also want an army to defend against European powers and so on. That's one side of it. The other side of it, relatedly, is a question of trade and commerce with European powers. Many disappointed American merchants in the mid 1780s. Like I said, there's this moment of optimism when they're like, well, we can trade with China, we can trade with Portugal, we can trade with absolutely anyone. But they realize quite quickly that that isn't going to create a kind of that isn't going to replace the loss of British trade that's happened as a result of the empire of the revolution. So instead, people start thinking, well, if we're going to make proper trade agreements and trade treaties, we really need a proper central government that can actually negotiate and that has a negotiating leverage. And without an army, without a kind of force, we've got no leverage, really. So that's another impetus towards let's have a stronger central government, which is basically what the Constitutional Convention is about, right? A stronger central government. One more thing, which is an internal political matter, and this is the thing that I actually pay most attention to. My first book, Gentlemen Revolutionaries, is mostly about this, right? And it's the question of social order inside the colonies themselves, inside the new states themselves. And the social order problem is also an economic problem, because what it's about is who gets to hold the reins of economic power. In the 1780s, state by state, basically ordinary voters get to have a considerable amount of control over economic policies, which mainly means stuff like printing money and collecting or not collecting the taxes. So when you have indebted farmers who have just lived through a decade of horrible warfare, right? They're completely underwater with debt. When they actually elect their representatives, mostly what they're saying is, please don't make us pay taxes, just print money and let us get on with it. Let there be more circulating mediums so that we can buy and sell our farm produce and everything will be fine. And then you have, so that's very, the politicians who represent those views get into power in many states through the 1780s, especially places like Rhode Island. That might seem small and insignificant, but they completely control Rhode Island, which is one of the reasons why it doesn't ratify the Constitution until the 1790s. But then there are other places like Pennsylvania, where it's really 50-50. So these rural loose money political interests are a significant force in Pennsylvania. But there is also another significant force, which is merchants and kind of basically elites. So the lawyers who work for the merchants and the politicians who come out of that legal class and so on. And those elites think this is disastrous. This loose money policy, printing money, it's inflationary, obviously. It's really, really bad for the long-term economic viability of the United States. It's bad for public credit, and it's bad for merchants themselves. So their position is we need to have a political framework above the states that will force them to behave responsibly, that will restrict their power to control the money supply, restrict their power to break contracts. So, for example, a state could pass a law saying, right, we're just going to write off all the debts that all of our citizens owe to the citizens of any other state or whatever. The Constitution, the federal Constitution, is going to make that impossible. It's going to introduce a whole new framework of restrictions that prevent state governments from exercising economic democracy, basically. So it's economic, but it's also social. It's also about asserting who in American society is actually going to be in charge of things, making sure that only sensible, educated, wealthy, liberal, knowledgeable people will be the ones making the rules for the whole of American society. And that's part of what's going into the Constitutional Convention as well.
It sounds from what you're saying there that this is effectively establishing an early form of class within the United States. Is that that's a big area of discussion? Is that overstating the situation?
No, I mean, we probably can't get into the whole big discussion of the viability of class as a kind of analytical category in the 18th century, but we absolutely could do that another time. But there are certainly many historians, and I am among these historians, who would say that one of the things that's going on in the 1780s is a kind of class struggle in the United States. It's not that the revolution was caused by a class struggle, but class struggle is certainly one of the outcomes, because now you have a new society, a new state. And you obviously have a struggle to control that state or to make that state into a form that is going to represent the interests of one class or another, basically. And the impetus behind the Constitutional Convention, the so-called nationalists of the 1780s, the mid-1780s, people like Robert Morris, the former superintendent of finance, he's a big Philadelphia merchant and a very big proponent of stronger central power, partly because he's held this office of superintendent of finance under the Congress and found it to be, not nearly enough power to actually get things done, right? So people like Robert Morris and then his friends and allies like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, these guys are the people who are thinking, well, this is too chaotic right now. We've given far too much power to ordinary American farmers and they don't know what the hell they're doing. So we really need to construct a new political system that's going to put us back in charge.
You're already kind of chomping at the next question I had in mind, really, but I'm still going to ask it. So, obviously, people today will know that we don't have the Articles of Confederation in the United States, and instead there is a new constitution. But correct me if I'm wrong. It seems that there was at least some sort of effort to kind of amend or to fix the Articles of Confederation as they were, at least as people went into the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So, what ideas did people have to fix the Articles of Confederation, and kind of what camps, I guess, did people coalesce around?
Yes, the main way of trying to fix the Articles of Confederation rather than create a new constitution was called the impost. And it's basically solving that problem I mentioned before, which is it doesn't have a taxing power. Congress doesn't have a taxing power under the Articles. So Robert Morris, back in 1782, 83, when he's finishing his term as superintendent of finance, he tries to introduce amendments to the Articles, which will give Congress the power to tax trade, basically, to impose customs duties, rather than trying to get all its money as basically gifts from the states. And that is unsuccessful. It's unsuccessful for a couple of reasons. One, that the representatives of the states don't want to give away this power, which is also money. They don't want to give that away to Congress, especially when Congress appears to be useless. We've just already won the war. What's the point of Congress? What are we even raising money for at this point? So the representatives of the states in Congress are not very favorable towards that, apart from the ones who are part of Morris's kind of so-called nationalist kind of coterie, so people like Hamilton. So that's one failed effort to fix the Articles that's happening within the Confederation Congress itself. Once you get to Philadelphia 1787, this is a meeting that has been orchestrated by Madison and Hamilton, right? And Morris behind the scenes. So it's been orchestrated already by the people who wish for quite dramatic changes to the way that the American states are organized collectively together. They don't necessarily think that they're just going to write a new constitution off the bat. So one way of approaching it might have been to put the impost back on the table and kind of make some adjustments to how Congress works. The problem is that Congress under the Articles of Confederation just doesn't fulfill, it fails to fulfill so many of the needs that these nationalists kind of perceive at this point, including the need for some kind of unified leadership. Like we were talking about before, there is no president that has any real power. There is, there is a unicameral legislature, which is also an executive. It doesn't match very well with the kind of political ideas, the Enlightenment, 18th century political ideas that people like Madison have, even though it does fit more closely with the ideas of people like Thomas Paine, right? The much more democratic ideas. So very quickly, once you actually get to Philadelphia, people are saying, we should just throw this out, and here's a whole new set of plans. And the one thing that remains an issue that kind of carries over and is still significant from the Articles of Confederation is, how are we going to represent the states themselves as opposed to representing the people who live in those states? And that's basically where you get the compromise of the Senate, the US Senate. Still a massive problem for politics today, right? The US Senate represents each state equally, regardless of the size of its population, regardless of its economic input to the government or any of those kinds of things. That is a holdover from Congress. That's how Congress worked. But alongside the Senate, we're now going to also have the House of Representatives, which is going to represent the population. So there's going to be way more congressmen from Virginia and New York, the biggest and most populous states, and way fewer from Rhode Island and Vermont and so on, Maryland. So that is a really radical rebalancing of how the US government actually works, even leaving aside the kind of key articles in the Constitution which say things like, basically, you no longer have the power to print paper money. You no longer have the power to break people's contracts and so on. So even leaving those aside, just the reformulation of how representation works in the US government is a major transformation. And basically my view is Madison goes into the convention knowing that he wants to achieve that. So it's really, the plan is to rewrite the Constitution from the start.
I mean, the key point about the Constitution is that it endures, albeit with amendments, as folks will be aware of. But why does it endure? What is so much better about this new system that means that it is able to form essentially the basis for US law and the political structure for the next 200 and however many years?
So you kind of preempted my easy retort to that, which is actually the Constitution doesn't last 250 years. It lasts until the Civil War, and then although the document remains, largely the same, really the way the document is understood is dramatically transformed by the U.S. Civil War, and then the amendments that came immediately after that, and then the further amendments in the early 20th century. Changing the way senators are appointed, changing the way the president is elected, changing the way that the federal government gets its taxing income. Those things are massive transformations to the US Constitution. So it's not really quite right to say that the US Constitution has remained kind of across those 250 years. That said, of course, the document itself does remain, and it is like a holy text. And it is a really enormous part of American civic identity. One of the reasons why, so now I'll try to answer your question, why is that the case? And I think one of the answers is that it's really quite short and it doesn't actually say very much. And those are both really useful things to have in a constitution because it allows you to then construct much more flexible arrangements around that core, that core of crucial institutional things. So, we still have the Supreme Court and Congress in its bicameral nature and the presidency. Those things haven't changed, but the way those things work has changed quite a lot. No one really understood how the Supreme Court would actually work when it was written into the Constitution. It wasn't until the first decade or so of the 19th century that the Supreme Court kind of gathered to itself the powers that it would have through the 19th century. And then again, the Supreme Court gathered further powers to itself after the Civil War in the early 20th century. So you can set up these institutions and then you let them run and they transform in their own way according to transformations in society and politics. And I think that's the genius of the US Constitution, that you just make it as minimal as you possibly can to achieve your goals and then let it go. And I think that's the problem, so later constitutions from other countries, there are many thousands of constitutions out there, and almost all of them are longer and more detailed than the US Constitution, and almost none of them are as long-lived. The average lifespan of a constitution is like less than 10 years. So we might want to look that up. I might want to go back and edit and look that up, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And I think that so the genius of the US Constitution is its brevity, basically, just providing the bare framework for the next 250 years.
It's a really interesting point, and it's one that risks touching on a certain nerve, I suspect, within modern US political discourse, this notion that certain ideas are unconstitutional and that the Constitution should be static. We often see this in relation to amendments. We see it in relation to gun laws. This idea that, well, it's written into the Constitution, and therefore, these are unalienable, unchangeable rights that are cast in stone rather than ink and paper. Is it fair to say that when this Constitution is created, the idea of changing it, of adapting it, of flexibility is very deliberately baked into the system to allow it to change over time?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's hard to say exactly what people in the convention thought was going to happen kind of a century from then, but we know that the constitution was immediately amended very significantly. What we mostly think about when we think about the US Constitution is actually a set of amendments to the Constitution, right? There's the Bill of Rights that was introduced in the early 1790s in response to opposition to the Constitution. So anti-federalists, people who were trying to mobilized the vote against the Constitution in 1787 to 88. Those were the guys saying, why the hell doesn't this have a set of protections for individual rights? And basically, the Federalists had to come back and say, well, vote for it and we'll put them in. So there was already a sense that this is a flexible thing that can be amended. And not only can it be amended, but it also has to be interpreted. So interpreting what the Constitution actually means obviously changes over time and is something, that is a matter of political debate and political kind of jockeying that takes place through the 1790s and way onwards. That's what I mean. When we talk about fixing the Constitution, my colleague at Stanford, Jonathan Ganap, wrote a book about this, where he really sets out the case very clearly that when it was written, the Constitution was not fixed. It was in flux. And it took decades of politics and decades of negotiation to actually decide what the things mean, what these institutions were, and how they were going to function in the US Constitution. And then, of course, barely had they decided those things that they then had to redecide them all over again because of the Civil War.
I don't really know how we've covered that much ground today, but we have, and it bodes well for future episodes in this series where we might have to talk about all the things we just have talked about, as all the opportunities and problems for the infant United States are multiplying. But that's for next time. Tom, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Can I just say, I am astonished that we have managed to cover all 9 questions in a single interview. That doesn't happen on the show, and we've rabbit holed. It's amazing. It bodes well for the future.
It's remarkable.
Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for your questions. I know, my answers, there are many imperfections, and some of them were longer than others, but hopefully that's going to work out okay.
Just like constitutions.
Right.
Dr. Tom Cutterham of the University of Birmingham, and his book is called Gentlemen Revolutionaries, Power and Justice in the New American Republic. It's available via Princeton University Press, and you received a little bit of a taster about the themes that he's talking about in that book. Tom, thank you, and thank you indeed for listening. We will see you all next time. Goodbye.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.